Welcome to the Nairobi Health Show. I've got Sam Visnic on the, I was going to say on the line, but that's kind of an old school term from back when telephones had rotary on them, isn't it? On the show, on the podcast. Sam, welcome to the show.
Hey, Dave, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this one.
I am too. We're talking about a topic I think is so important because it's so practical and it affects everybody. And of course, there's many elements of health that do, but this is one where people can make really meaningful changes in their life because they can often overcome persistent problems that they might be having that are actually limiting them from performance, just normal day-to-day performance or athletic performance or whatever it might be. And so for those of you listening, let me read Sam's bio, and then we'll dive into his expertise. Sam Visnic has spent his life studying the fundamental aspects of human health with a focus on movement and clinical massage therapy. In a world of specialists, surgical procedures, drugs, and quick fix remedies, he is committed to finding and developing strategies that help people stuck at the gap. Sam has studied dozens of methodologies for uncovering the root cause of aches and pains, some of which include pain science, hands-on soft tissue, massage techniques, myofascial release, one I really want to dig into with you, and coaching movement. And so for those of you out there that have aches and pains, which maybe everyone over the age of 40, I don't know.
Pretty much.
Somewhere something hurts, right? And so, Sam, you are an expert with helping people with these kind of things.
And then, when we talk about pain, I mean, this can definitely have a huge range. We're talking about simple things like, somebody's active, they're a weekend warrior, they like to run, and, something nags them when they're running and so forth. But then I also work with people that just have relentless, complex pain that they can't feel like they can make it through the day just because of the pain. So that could be all over the map here.
Okay, fantastic. And what brought you to this point? Where in your own personal journey did you decide, hey, I want to get into pain management and myofascial release as a career? How did that happen?
You know what? I think about this a lot and how this kind of trajectory had started, which is interesting. And it does have something that how I got into this was based on my personality. When I started, when I got out of high school, I mean, I was, at that point where my parents said, you've got two options here. You're going to go to school or you're going to go get a job. And both of those lead the same direction because we're not paying for your college. So, we had to go get a job. To me, I was a young kind of meathead type where I was the skinny kid. So, I was always just like, I remember my parents took me to the doctor. My dad says, there's something wrong with him. He won't gain weight and he eats all the time. I was that kid. And now today, considering all the problems you could have, so of course there was nothing wrong with me. I was just kind of like the classic physiological, what we call ectomorph, the skinny kid. So weight training was where it was at for me. And, it was not an easy thing for me because I didn't have a lot of great genetics for muscle. But to me, that was the most obvious profession. At the time, there's not a lot of personal trainers. This was around 1999-ish. And, but I said, you know what, I could get paid for teaching people to exercise. I mean, this is no problem. So, this was at a turning point in the fitness industry where, most fitness programs and exercise programs are either out of the 80s, the aerobics fitness boom, group exercise, or number two, it was like bodybuilding. Even athletes weren't doing, movement-based programs. They were just lifting weights.
Okay.
And
yeah.
When the certification started to take off, one in particular that was is now a renowned one, talked a lot about posture and movement. And they were really diving into this really uber specificity about fixing posture and so forth. And this is at the time where you're starting to see people at the gym exercising on big rubber balls, and they were doing kind of like non-traditional exercises. And I got swept up into that. And in particular, it was appealing for individuals who had just weekend warriors, aches and pains, people coming in, and they were afraid to kind of go to the weightlifting room because they had these problems. They had back problems and so forth. And it was a nice time to go in there and start giving them these non-traditional exercises that didn't feel stressful to their body, but were more about movement and so forth. So I developed obviously a good knack for helping people design exercise programs around their aches and pains. Now, the intention wasn't to get them better from pain. It was just to get them to exercise and keep coming back, so not hurting them. So throughout this process, what of course happened is that people actually started saying, hey, my back doesn't hurt anymore. My knees don't hurt anymore. And, I was actually helping these people get out of pain. So, I started to realize the opportunity there of just kind of making myself known for being the guy who, if you had these orthopedic issues or you had health issues, come see me because I could get you exercising without pain. And then, of course, that kind of transitioned into come to me, I will help you get out of pain. And so the course of my career was really about going that trajectory, about accumulating lots of resources on what I was actually doing that was facilitating this process. I mean, I was doing it, but then you start to get to the realization of like, what am I doing that's making this work? And that kind of got the ball rolling. And that's how it all started.
It's fascinating, as is the time frame that you're talking about. Have you read or are familiar with Becoming a Supple Leopard by Kelly Starrett?
Oh, yeah.
Of course. Yeah. I kind of guessed, but well, the beginning of his book is really, really interesting. If you remember those few chapters when he describes how when you're talking about pre-1999, back when, we were still in the Cold War in the late 80s, right? And so athleticism had its secrets. The Russians had incredible gymnasts and ballerinas and all types of athletes, weightlifters, etc. And they kept their secrets, as did Europeans, as did all the various countries. And when he wrote about this, and then how the emergence of the internet allowed trainers, massage therapists, functional movement experts from all over the world to suddenly start sharing all their information, how we had a flood of information where suddenly a guy like yourself is no longer in a laboratory of one,
yes,
with the patients that come in, right? And I thought that was an absolutely fascinating chapter as he explained how that happened and the convergence of the incredible amount of information. And interestingly, there's probably a lot of people, maybe even several listening, that aren't really aware of that and aren't aware that a trainer like yourself, and do I call you a trainer, by the way? What do you go by as a professional title or description?
I mean, we always have these associations to certain types of disciplines, right? Trainer almost is always based upon fitness. And yes, I mean, I help people develop fitness, and that's probably a lot more of what I used to do. Most of the time people are coming in here for pain. So a lot of times it's for manual therapy. So I'm more associated into the clinical massage therapy aspect of what I do rather than the trainer part of what I do, although it's a pretty good marriage of the two.
And yet, of course, here we're on a podcast where, there'll be thousands of people listen to this, tens of thousands, actually, and you won't be able to massage them all.
No.
But yet you are an expert guest, doing a variety of podcasts, showing up on shows like mine, by invitation to share your knowledge. What's the end game for you? How do people apply what you learn that you on a podcast, what you teach them on a podcast?
Well, there's a lot of stuff that you learn that actually, and I probably resisted this a lot more than I should have over the years about doing kind of virtual consulting, because I was always, saying that I could tell you stuff, but I need to put my hands on you and I need to teach you this stuff in person. But the terrain has changed, especially with certain types of pain and we'll dive into this, that fundamentally one of the most important things about chronic pain relief is understanding pain. And there's a lot of neuroscience research that's supporting this, that we must understand pain. And we kind of put it all in one box, and there's different types of pain. And mainly when we'll talk about the difference between acute pain and chronic pain, which are two completely different animals, that our brain's understanding of what's happening to us is very important. For example, and I'll give you a quick example. If you roll your ankle and the thing swells up like a softball, you look down and there's no question how you could sort out why you have pain, because your ankle looks like a softball and it's injured. But when that tissue heals, and let's say 6 months later, your ankle is still bothering you, you look down and the doctor's also telling you that tissue is healed, but you still feel pain. You know that there's something wrong with that, but you're not getting an explanation for why that's happening. This leads the door to be wide open to interpretations that you may have about what is going on with that ankle. A lot of people are told things, and we get this a lot from our backs, that you may develop, wherever this comes from, this belief that you have a bad back. Well, we don't really know what that means, but to the individual, what's the movie or the images that they have in their head about what that means may severely restrict their lifestyle in some way because they feel they might be damaging their back.
Right.
Now, that becomes a very problematic belief to have, and it doesn't have any evidence to it, but yet we live out our lives through what we believe and what we perceive. Now, this isn't even talking about the mechanics of what's going on in their back, tight muscles or anything else. We're just chatting about the behavior that is based upon something they believe or their perception of what is happening. And that's where the consulting aspect of what I do has now started to change, where people say, I would love to do a virtual consult just to talk with you because nobody talks about this. Or just the explanation of what is going on can bring people a degree of hope. It can bring them a degree of release or relaxation about what it is that they're going through, because there's actually an explanation for what is happening to them. So that's what I mean, that the terrain has changed. And I've realized that in my work, this is normal everyday business. People come in and I teach them these things and so forth. But as I'm going out and doing more podcasts and talking to people, and the messages that I'm receiving, this information is not out there. It's not out there on a large scale. In circles it is, but it's just not mainstream yet. And I think that's where the contribution that I have can be put forth, is to talk about these things and really get that information out there.
Okay, fantastic. And at the end, of course, we'll have you share with everyone how they can get a hold of you. And those suffering with acute pain might want to schedule a consult with Sam, have him help you out. In the meantime, you alluded to pain and the different types of pain. And it's a very interesting thing, because we talk about people having different amounts of pain tolerance. And I'm a meditator, and I've been to meditative retreats. And even in meditation, sometimes they'll ask you if you have any pain, and take your pain as an object of meditation, which is a really interesting thing to do. Because when you sit with pain, it is interesting. You talked about the beliefs and perceptions. We absolutely have beliefs and perceptions about pain. I'm not saying pain isn't real, but at the same time, you can sit with your pain, and the experience can change. And as a matter of fact, there are some guided meditations, and occasionally I'll do a guided meditation. It's an hour long. And one of the instructions may be, try to hold perfectly still, no matter whether you have an itch or discomfort. During this meditation, try to maintain as close you can to perfect stillness. And even then, Sam, it's pretty interesting when you try to sit. So we're talking about, I'm not even talking about in the lotus position, which I can't sit in, by the way.
Yeah. I know that feeling.
I'm just talking about in a chair. So if you sit and get comfortable, and you're doing a meditation, which should be absolutely pain-free. But if you just sit still, pain can creep in. And all of a sudden you realize after just a few minutes, oh, I want to move. Oh, that doesn't feel very good right there. Maybe in your knee or in your back or in your neck or in your elbow. It can be anywhere. And so it's quite interesting. So we have everything from what you mentioned, the sprained ankle, obviously you got an injury. But then we have aches and pains, which could be physiological, often is, but it can also be simply mental. It can simply be energy. And then, as you said, it can be quite vague. So the person has pain in their back. And someone told them along the way, they caught this term, you said, bad back. And so talk about that for a minute. You obviously are dealing with this, and is some of the pain people are dealing with just psychosomatic, or is it a combination of dealing with the pain along with ruling out injury? How do you deal with this on a personal level with people?
Well, so there's a lot of common thread, like a story that people oftentimes go to when they're kind of entering into the medical system with pain, and then how they kind of get to this point. But let's back up for a minute and let's talk about what's actually happening here. A lot of people don't know this, but there are no pain receptors. There's no pain nerves. There's no pain fibers in the human body. There are information receptors. So these nerve endings have these receptors. Anything you can feel, you have a receptor for. Temperature, pressure, stretch, lactic acid, fatigue. There's lots of different types of receptors. These receptors send neutral information to the brain. So if the temperature goes up, temperature starts to go up on the tissue, that information is going to the brain. Okay, it goes up the spinal cord. First of all, if the immediate effect is so strong, you'll have a reflex. So, something quick will happen, right? But for the most part, that information goes to the spinal cord. If it gets past that point, it goes to the brain. How much of it? The brain now has different processing centers. Okay, there's not one area in the brain that just processes this information. So this idea that we see in like science fiction that you're just going to shut pain off in the brain is just not going to happen, because that's not how it works. The information is being processed by different filters. There's one part of the brain that's interpreting what is this sensation, what's the degree of the sensation. Then it passes it on to another part of the brain. Another part of the brain has a memory filter. And we've all had that experience where we feel a muscle start to pull and we go, ooh, I remember that feeling, as if that could be something bad, right? So we have a memory filter. So all of this information is processing rapidly in the moment, lightning speed. And those parts of the brain are essentially coming in together to make a decision as to whether or not we are experiencing something that is potentially threatening. If it is threatening to a sufficient degree, we're going to get this knife into the input of our conscious awareness, which might be doing whatever it's doing at that time, to say, hey, pay attention to me. That is why pain is so noxious. It grabs your attention to tell you to take an action.
Right.
Now, that information processing is not 100% related to structural damage and in fact, a lot of cases, we have pain signals that have no tissue damage whatsoever. We've even had those times where somebody bumps your elbow and you go, ow, but then it didn't really hurt. We've all had that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then we've had times where we've actually had tissue damage and we felt no pain at all. Have you ever woken up and found a big bruise on your thigh or in your arm and you're like, how did I get this?
Yep.
There was tissue
damage. And it must have
damage.
hurt at the time.
Well, it didn't hurt because there was tissue damage. The brain deleted that information. So this is how complex pain is. So we have all of this stuff happening. We have to have information generally going from the body to the brain. For the most part, I think a lot of us generally agree with this concept. There has to be information that goes from the body to the brain. The brain has to perceive that information and then make a decision if there's pain. So it's a two-way street. It's bottom up and it's top down. There are cases where there is no information coming from the body that we know of, but it is coming from the brain. Phantom limb pain is one of those things. If an individual doesn't have a limb anymore, but they feel pain in the limb, well, we know that the limb is not generating that information. So there has to be information in the brain that is processing as if the limb was there. So there are multiple things that can happen here. This is all generally happening outside of our conscious awareness. So we're not aware of this. There's a second layer of this, which is your conscious brain. That's your thinking part of your brain that can think about and make meaning or associate things to that experience. So if you're feeling pain, you can go, oh my gosh, what if this is broken? What if that is, or, I hate my pain, or I hate that my back feels this way. We can have like a layer of evaluation to what we're experiencing. And that can be an issue too. So when we say that things, for example, our pain is in the brain, which is a common kind of thing that people tend to say in the neuroscience field, we're not saying that it's in the conscious mind, that the mind itself, you're making a decision to feel pain. What we're saying is that the central processing unit that processes the information from the body is the brain. That's the computer. And it has to get that information from somewhere. And then we have a separate process, which is the conscious mind, which is interacting with this. So that's kind of how I think about these things, is they're on separate tracks. And when people have in particular a certain type of response to their pain that we could say is negative or frustrating or whatever it is that we feel, certain mindfulness techniques can be very appropriate and very positive for the person. So rather than reacting, let's say, negatively to the pain experience, If they go into a meditative state where they sit neutrally with the pain experience, that is going to be a very therapeutic process for someone. But it doesn't necessarily stop the information coming from the body to the brain. So we get into this kind of conversation of, can I mentally control pain? To some degree, depending on how you interact with it and depending on how your unique pain experience works. And for everybody is having a unique pain experience because of all of these different factors. The challenge is figuring out what part or role all of those things are in you as the pain sufferer, and then we can apply the right therapeutic strategy to that. So I think that's it, kind of like in a ballpark view, how I approach working with somebody with pain, if that makes sense.
That's really interesting. Yeah. It's really interesting to have you explain that, how it works mentally, and as a system.
Yes.
It's not just, oh, this hurts. It's interesting as human beings, again, back to the beliefs and perceptions. One person says, it's hot in here, right? It might be 72 degrees room temperature. And so to other people, no, it's not hot in here, but it's our communication. The person A should have simply said, I feel hot. That's just more accurate, right?
That's correct. Their receptors are more sensitive to that temperature stimulation relative to the person next to them.
Yeah. And so then they can be a little more scientific about it. And the other person says, well, I don't feel hot. Let's check the temperature. Saying to you guys, maybe you have a fever.
Right.
But we tend to think that, frankly, a lot of it, we as human beings often think we're the center of the universe, and however we feel is how everything is.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. And that happens in a lot of different ways, as we can imagine, that, we find somebody who discovers that a certain muscle is associated with one person's back problem, and therefore this muscle is the root cause of back pain. And we all know that that's
right.
Ridiculous. It's not true. But yet it kind of starts a cascade, of well, this is the solution or that is the solution. And this is rampant in a lot of areas of health. And we know that, in experiences, especially in things like pain, there's research that shows there's no correlation a lot of times between certain things that people say are associated to pain, like posture, disc bulges. There's lots of people with really horrendous posture who have no pain. There's lots of people with disc bulges in their spine that have no pain, and the research supports this. So these generalizations kind of become a problem. And for me, someone like me, I look at these things and these things are, okay, you have a disc bulge. Okay, this muscle is tight. I don't know if that's related to your pain. But as we kind of go through the process of, let's free the muscle up. Let's do some mobilizations that'll loosen your spine, and let's see how you perceive that and what your experience is. And we start to individualize the therapeutic approach. Now, I have ways of doing things that tend to work on a regular basis, and I stick to those things.
Yeah.
Certainly, so I have my own system, but we are dealing with that. And I think one of the analogies that I like to tell people is, if I have in my hand, I have a tarantula, right? And I line up 100 people in a row, you're going to have a lot of different experiences to that tarantula. And depending on how close I am, if I'm 20 feet away from these people, I got 10 people running. Yeah. I got 5 to 10 people in freeze mode. And then I've got 5 to 10 people or more coming up and going, hey, can I touch it?
They want to take it home.
So you've got one stimuli, and you have a variety of human responses to that stimuli. That is very similar to what we have in the human body. We have a stimuli, but the response to that stimuli can vary dramatically depending on the individual.
One of the takeaways I just want to recommend everyone listening from this conversation, if it isn't clear, I want to make it really clear. Don't self-diagnose. I have done that so many times over my life, and now I look back and think, dummy, why did I do that? Sam, let me just tell you a brief story, and then I'll have you comment on it as a professional. Okay. So I used to do a lot of running. I would do adventure racing. I did a marathon. I did many half marathons, 10Ks, 5Ks, triathlons, adventure racing. That was a big part of my MO for about 8 years, 40 to 48. And then I transitioned to other things. But during that time, I would run about 30 miles a week. And my knee started to bother me. And it started off very small, and it got worse and worse and worse and worse. So one day, halfway through a long run on a Saturday, I was done. I had to call my wife on the phone, ask her to come get me. I couldn't run anymore. I went to my physiotherapist. I said, I need you to fix my knee. So he said, okay, what's going on? Ask the questions, puts me on a treadmill, has the video camera beside, a video camera in front, video cameras all over the machine. I think he had like 4 different angles. He said, just try to run as you would. I know you're in pain, but let's just see how just do a little jog. And Sam, it was amazing. By the time we're done, he's like, your knee hurts because your hip is whacked. I'm like, really? He goes, yeah, the problem's in your hip. And he showed me the video, and my right leg was tracking correctly. It was going forward and landing in the right place, and my foot was landing as it should, and so on. My left leg, and I couldn't feel this, my left leg was coming into the center line, swinging around a little bit. And so my right foot's going like this, my left foot's swinging inwards, because the hip was I don't remember, too tight. Anyways, we worked on the hip. And when we solved the hip problem, the knee problem went away. So it was a poor hip move, and he called this upstream, downstream. And he said it was similar to what you just said, really, that as an amateur, right? I just think I have a bad knee. I'm expecting them to put the heat on it, to do some massage, to do whatever they're going to do, right? The little machine that zaps.
Yes. Yeah. The TENS unit, right?
Whatever, right? And no, they went to work. Getting me, they had me work on my gait, to do exercises ahead. He said when I was finally able to run again, he wanted me to run on a track on the lines and pay some attention to where that left foot was falling, and retrain myself to have a better gait. And since that time, I have not self-diagnosed anything. I've not assumed that I know why I have pain in certain areas, and I've counted on professionals. And I imagine you see this all the time.
Well, and that's a perfect example of when we go from that kind of big picture talk about pain and we start diving into what we actually do when we do movement work and we do massage work. And there's stuff that's been around forever. And this probably doesn't surprise you, that things that we know that are just not into the mainstream is always behind the times dramatically. And in physical medicine, and we're talking about movement work and so forth, even though we've seen the field explode in terms of knowledge, by my personal opinion, the field is still 20 to 30 years behind what we actually know. It's that far behind.
Really?
20 years ago, I would say I was 15 years ahead of the curve because of my mentor. My mentor was teaching about corrective exercise, full body. He was teaching the concept of holism. Look at the person's nutrition when they have pain, look at their lifestyle, when nobody was talking about this. Everybody was bathed into structural mechanics. Now, fast forward all these years, that is mainstream now. And that's what I had known then. The field has now advanced way past that. So we're kind of working along, and we're getting more and more. But I'm bringing this up because one of the fathers of musculoskeletal medicine, Dr. Karol Levitt, who is a neurology doctor out of Prague, he just recently passed away. He was in his 90s, used to say all the time throughout most of his career that he who is looking at the area where the pain is, it will, largely be lost. And the reason why we say this is because the way that the whole body works together as a unit, we're oftentimes outside of a direct injury, right? You sprain something, whatever.
Yes.
On the chronic end of things, we're always looking at the area oftentimes where the pain is the area that is basically the nerve receptors are telling your brain, I've had enough. I'm just going to keep sending information here because I need you to get the load off of me. That is only the area where you're experiencing the discomfort. The restriction in motion oftentimes is the thing that is causing that limb or that area to constantly work too much. So if we're always looking at the area of the pain is, which is how the medical insurance model works, which they're only approving treating the painful area, then you're not going to be looking at all of the other body parts and so forth that might be weak, might be not moving as well as it could be, which is causing this issue to constantly be the squeaky wheel.
Right.
So when we look at that, and that's a very difficult thing because that's not common. 99% of the people that see me say my back hurts. And if they come in And, I obviously have a process to inform them of this, but if I don't work on their lower back, they're going to be like, what are you doing? And so just,
Right.
just wait, let me free this area up. My back feels better. Okay. Well, that wasn't, magic. What it was is I took the load off of this area by getting that thing moving. And we still obviously work on the area where the pain is, because that's very helpful for lots of different ways. But you could take that same concept of what we just talked about and really apply that globally as well. There's plenty of circumstances where, you're working on a structural mechanical thing where that person goes, my problem is my lower back. And then we assess them and we start finding there's not a lot of stuff in here that's going on. But then we find out that this person has an underlying metabolic condition, an inflammatory condition in their system, and that their whole nervous system is far more sensitive. So you take this small biomechanical insult, and yet it's now registered as 2 to 3 times higher because the whole system is stressed and inflamed. And I talk about this a lot. My wife is a clinical nutritionist, and her specialty is gastrointestinal inflammation and SIBO, gut problems, and so forth. And when we see these people with rampant inflammatory problems, and they just, it's hard to kind of get those concepts to understand together, that not only are we talking about body parts relate to each other, but the inside and the outside relates to each other too. So you're right. Don't self-diagnose, because especially if you've been to multiple practitioners and everybody has looked at that area, and this is common. I've been to 6 practitioners, a chiro, an acupuncturist, a massage therapist, and I've been treated by all of them and none of this stuff worked. Well, maybe, just maybe, they were working on the wrong problem, or what they thought was the problem and wasn't the problem.
Okay, so I want you to give us one practical bit of advice here on myofascial release. Myofascial release is a big thing. Now in CrossFit, you talk about some places being behind. CrossFit has done a pretty good job with functional movement.
Very much.
Many times in a CrossFit gym, they all of them have rollers and balls, and many of those trainers will spend time. I have a lacrosse ball here behind me and a foam roller, and you'll be proud of me, Sam. I try to do 10 minutes of myofascial release before I work out every day. Now, I know to a guy like you, that might not even be enough. You might be telling me, hey, you ought to, but anyways, I do 10 minutes before I work out.
Yeah.
I just focus on one area. I do the Kelly Starrett thing where he said, rather than quickly do 5 areas, why not just focus on your IT bands today, or on whatever area you're going to work. So if it's leg day, maybe just roll your thighs really well and your IT bands a little bit, or upper body, roll your lats, which, by the way, is one of the most awful feelings in the world the first few times you do it.
It's definitely up there for one of the top ones for me.
It's a bizarre nerve feeling for some reason. When I get my weight on a lat just below my shoulder, it's just this strange type of pain I don't have anywhere else. I don't know why. But talk to us about this, and what could people listening do? I mentioned my lacrosse ball. I roll my shoulders with the ball. I stand on the ball. I stand on golf balls to loosen up and work on ankle flexibility. And I've had my what do you call that? I can't remember.
Plantar fasciitis.
Plantar fasciitis.
That's a fun one.
But that really fun. And my physical therapist told me, actually, on the way, he's the one who told me up the golf balls. He said, Dave, there'll come a day when you can stand full weight on both these balls, one under each feet, and you're close to arriving when you get to that point. I see you kind of cringing when you hear that, but at first I could barely touch them, and over time I was able to really dig in there, and actually that rolling really helped as part of the process. But talk to us about myofascial release and a practical way. And I've given my ideas already of what I'm doing, but could it be better? Is there something else you recommend? Should we be doing this every day?
I think because myofascial release means different things, because it's a term, and in the industry, old school myofascial release is related, are oftentimes thought of by a guy named John Barnes, who is a physical therapist, who has this whole other system of myofascial release, and we use it for other names too. Old school myofascial release has nothing to do with what we see most of the time. What it has to do with is this idea of there are many layers of connective tissue, fascia, et cetera, in the system, and we can influence them with superficial layers moving top down. So a lot of myofascial release techniques are basically skin stretching. So you put stretches on the skin, and it's a very slight amount, almost to the point where you're like,
Oh,
is this even doing anything?
like the
And
KT tape
even
idea?
probably about like that. And length of time, 3 to 5 minute releases. Now, the
Okay.
principles behind myofascial releases is arguable, and that would be worth another discussion. But
Okay.
what we are saying that we're doing, or what a lot of these techniques and technologies say that they're doing, the research does not support that that is what's happening. And in fact, it's completely different. We don't believe any longer, and it's highly questionable, that we are actually deforming fascia, breaking up adhesions, a lot of the classical explanations that have been thought. Now, my problem with this is, and why I explain this, you'll get where I'm going with this, is that therapy has gotten this reputation that the more brutal it is, the more effective it is. And this is a huge mistake,
Right.
because if we believe that we're breaking up adhesion, fascia, and scar tissue, our brain as the therapist means I have to push harder. But when we know, based on what the science shows us, for example, fascia, the cranial fascia, 5,000 pounds per square inch of toughness. A lion's teeth could barely chomp through the fascia in your skull. So to think that we could deform fascia in the head with our thumbs or with it doesn't add up.
Huh.
So if we're not doing that, and we're certainly not doing that in the course of one session or a 10-minute foam rolling session, we need to take away that concept of saying we're releasing fascia and kind of do away with it for a second. It doesn't mean that it doesn't work, but why it's working is that the results are more what we call neurophysiological. We're altering the neurology. That is why it works. So when we think about it from that standpoint, how much does it take to really shift your neurology? It doesn't take as much as you think. So what over the years, I'd say in 20 years, my techniques have gotten so much more gentle. I used to push really hard on people because that's what I was taught. But now the techniques I use a lot of times with respiration and altering position and doing skin stretching is producing better effects.
Oh.
And the idea is, remember, like with weight training, but maybe not so much because that still gets us into the mentality of pushing. The idea is that we have nerves that are sensitive. They're sensitive to different things. And let's say pressure, you put your foot on that golf ball, and depending on the sensitivity of those nerve receptors, it's going to elicit a painful response because you're pushing on it. Not necessarily a negative one, but it feels good. So let's say on a 1 to 10 scale, 10 is like, I can't even do this because I'm in so much pain, I can't relax. Let's say we push on that golf ball until it's like a 3 or a 4, right? Now, the idea is to get the nervous system to be stimulated enough that we're going to register some sensitivity, some stuff's going on in there, but not so high that we can't actually relax our nervous system and not feel threatened by it.
Okay.
So when I push on somebody, let's say I was doing a massage, same thing as a golf ball, and I push on that foot, I'm going to go, let me know when that's a 5 out of a 10 scale. And I push on that, and the person goes, that's about a 5. And I'm like, so it's mildly uncomfortable. So if I were to measure your heart rate variability or your heart rate, you're probably going to have a slight increase in heart rate and holding your breath a little bit because it's a 5. It's stimulating. It could be threatening. Now, if I hold that and I tell the person, take a deep breath and relax, and they go, okay, and take a sigh. Okay, now did that pressure? They go, well, you let the pressure go. No, I didn't. Your nervous system relaxed because it realized it wasn't threatened by this stimuli, and it drops and it goes to a 4 or 3. This is the process of why my entire company is called Release, because that release is the magic. And most people miss that because the therapy is pushed to a 6, 7, 8, 9. The person's nervous system, they're sweating on the table and they're gripping. Their nervous system is clearly going to feel threatened by that experience.
How interesting.
A lot of people will, for the most part, a healthy nervous system that doesn't feel too threatened is probably going to have an okay response to that. And the problem is practically we can't take what you do with athletes like CrossFitters and so forth and endurance runners who have a lot of response to pain tolerance and take that and convert that. If I did that technique with somebody who has fibromyalgia, number one, they'd be in a lot more pain because I would be triggering the alarm on their nervous system severely. And number two, they would never come back because they'd be in a lot of pain. So when you learn what works over here with nervous systems that are very sensitive, and we look over here, we're like, this is way too much. And it's way too much because it can be too much, but it doesn't mean that's ideal. So when I
Right.
do myofascial release and I urge people, slow down, get the release in the tissue and realize that the change we're looking for is neurological. It is not structural. And if
Interesting.
that mentality shift will start to change how you do things, and you'll find that you'll probably get the exact same results with less pain, digging into tissue, but it'll also start to give you to open up new ideas for other techniques that might actually get you even further along than you thought you could.
I love that. So basically, I might be going at it too hard, so I could probably slow down a little bit, a little
Maybe.
more time breathing into it, and like I said, I've always thought of it as structural. For example, if I foam roll my thighs, I'll often come across bumps, right? And
Yep.
then I'll roll those until I feel them go in, and I feel like I've had success, and I'm ready to go into leg day. And so it does feel physiological, but I can see what you mean. That's just what it's telling my brain. It's just pain, right?
Well,
Not necessarily.
muscles are just kind of dumb. They lay there and then they dance when we shoot electricity through them. So remember that the tone in the muscle tissue and what you perceive is driven by the nervous system. So the nervous system is more apt to change quick. And we see all these things like, we do demonstrations where somebody can't rotate their head really well, and I have them touch their teeth if they're a front end biter. And if I put a dental appliance or a mouth guard in their mouth and I have them move around and then their neck range of motion increases 20 degrees, I didn't change their neck structure. I changed their neurology. And that is the stuff that I always just try to encourage people, but you'll see that now the vast majority, there's so many neurological techniques that are wonderful that you can do to increase range of motion rapidly. And they're very low to no pain or discomfort at all. And it's just kind of like that's what I'm saying. We're a little Paleolithic in our approach to things because the neurology stuff just isn't out there yet. And when I show people these techniques, they're like, I've been digging on my IT bands for 6 months and I could have just done this. And I'm like, no, we know more now.
Interesting.
So
I love that. I'm really interested. I roll my ITs all the time and it hurts like crazy, but I need to do it better. And can I learn that? How do I learn that from you? Do you have information on your website, and what resources do you have? Have you written a book?
I put a lot of stuff out on Instagram because, Instagram is a very visual thing. So I like to put a lot of my structural stuff on Instagram because that's what people like to see. And then, I follow up with techniques like we talk about on my website. I have a membership area where I like to kind of put all of that other stuff in there. So I do have a book. And in the book was interesting to bring that up. The book is actually a digital book, which really started out to me as like a compendium, because what I wanted to do was, rather than everything sounding so anecdotal, or there's so much information that I don't want to have a client sit here or somebody and just launch information at them where it's so overwhelming. It needs to be slower, digestible. So having a book where I said, go read this chapter on this book. And I talk about the basic concept, but I also show you all the supporting evidence in the research. Because a lot of times I tell people things like, for example, I'll drop this dinger here. The number one thing that affects pain sensitivity and chronic pain sufferers has nothing to do with structure. It's sleep. So when somebody doesn't sleep well, they perceive more pain and nerve sensitivity. So they're like, what? How come nobody told me this? Go read the research in my book. I'll show you where the research is and what it says. And then, people always say the same phrase, and that's the title of my book. Well, why didn't my doctor tell me that? So that became the name of the book. And I'm
Interesting.
So all these chapters I broke down and talk about these things. But once you get a working understanding of kind of like where I'm coming from this, it becomes a little easier and more receptive to go, oh, well, I understand why I might do this little weird eye integration technique. This is stupid. What am I doing? But when you see how much science supports it, and then you're willing to try it, and then you see the results, then it kind of makes a paradigm shift for you. So I feel like it's hard to jump in with both feet with this. It's a little easier to get the toes in and to start kind of working toward it. So that's how I'm trying to introduce it.
Tell us the name of your book again.
The book is called Why Didn't My Doctor Tell Me This?
Fantastic. And what's your website?
It's on releasemuscletherapy.com. You can get it for free. If you scroll down on the page, there's a members area. It's free. And I put all my stuff in there so you can get access to it.
Muscletherapy.com.
Releasemuscletherapy.com.
And there's the book there. You also have a membership area. So people with chronic pain, they can join your membership and get access to all your best stuff.
And some free neuro, release techniques. I got one on the lower back, which people love. I call it instant back pain relief. Does it work for 100% of people in every single situation? No, but it is a form of stimulation that actually is very helpful for people when they have backaches and pains, especially when they're sitting all day.
Fantastic. Sam, this has been really interesting. I can tell you're a true professional, cutting edge. You got all kinds of great ideas. I'm going to change some of my habits based on our conversation and learn more about what you're doing. And I hope others listening will do the same.
Yes.
I got one last question that I'm going to start asking guests. And I did give you some heads up about this, but
Sure.
I found that almost everyone along the way, there's some, you mentioned you had a mentor, and we all have at some time had a mentor or just listened to something or read a book where something hit us, maybe just at the right time, that caused us to make a quantum leap in some area. Maybe it was to finally lose that 30 pounds or to overcome a bad habit or whatever it was that made a big difference in our health. Do you have a story personally of when something, a tip or idea or something a mentor said just really gave you that type of experience?
I would probably relate something to kind of like what you had talked about earlier, which was sitting with pain, right? I mean, and having that almost separation of something that was happening with you, but also at the same time, you were able to kind of sit with something. One of the things early on, and in particular my 20s, story for another time, but I had a lot of physical problems, and I have issues with small intestinal bowel overgrowth, bacterial overgrowth, and in my late teens started having issues with panic attacks. And at the time, this was certainly related to diet and a lot of other stuff that I was doing at the time. But these issues was very classically what a lot of people tend to experience. They have some kind of like initial situation where they have a panic attack or something, and it's so threatening to them. Now, at the course at the time, I think it was 16 or 17, there was no thought in my head that I was actually like, go tell somebody, go tell my parents, go tell and get any help with this. So I just kind of dealt with it. And what happens classically, and this is something that we talk about, and this is where in the pain education, this is similar. You have an experience and then you create a meaning for this. The problem with this, especially with these kinds of behaviors or these things that occur, is that we actually start to develop a story or a situation around that issue. And in particular, what would happen is I was starting to become fearful of having a panic attack, which started to now start creating avoidance behavior. And you start to see this whole psychosocial dynamic playing out. And I would start adapting behaviors in the way that I was living and so forth to try to avoid these things. But when these things would come on, you're oftentimes not in an experience or a situation where you could easily somehow remove yourself and cope with it. So it was a very troubling kind of situation. Now, I wish I could tell you exactly when this occurred, but I remember what started to change the direction of it. And I think I was in some kind of situation where I was not able to actually exit. Because a lot of times when you're feeling a panic or something, you want to remove yourself from the situation. You want to remove yourself from the stimuli and try to get yourself to some kind of place that feels safe to calm yourself down. I recall I was probably in a situation where I was not able to do that. So something clicked in my mind where I said to myself, okay, this passes. I've had this before. This passes. I'm just going to sit here and write it out. So rather than fighting with it, being anxious about it, getting resentful toward it, I just sat with it and I waited. And guess what? It just passed. Once that happened, something triggered in my mind to realize that there is a separation between the messages that my body was giving me and my response to those things. That led me into down the line, not immediately, but number one, I saw a reduction in my panic attacks right away. I don't recall having them as frequently after that. But I guess that's a point of illustrating that when you break that connection between those two, what was the bigger problem? The panic attack or the biopsychosocial elements that were antagonizing or causing the panic attacks, or how I was reacting to them? That was interesting.
Right.
So later come to find that it was blood sugar imbalances and my gut problems and so forth that were probably triggering the situations, but I was certainly making them worse by my response to it. So later on, that led me toward the pathway of when I started learning about hypnotherapy, neurolinguistic programming, which I became a big fan of after Tony Robbins. That really turned the trajectory of me realizing what I did there. I kind of intuitively figured it out. I said intuitive by accident. And then it led
Yeah.
me into, I need to understand the structure of how this works so that I can understand now how to apply those things to not only other problems that I had, but of course I could use that to help other people. So I'd say that
Very
that
cool.
was a big one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Sam, it's been a fantastic episode. I've kept you a little longer than I planned, but we gave so much great information. I'm glad you could take the time.
Awesome.
And thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yes. Thank you so much. I loved it.
Yeah, me too. And for those of you listening, this is Dave Sherwin wishing you health and success.